the pregnant woman knew her rights. She was an older woman, right? And she said, "No, I don't have to get up because the state law said you don't have to go up your seat if there's nowhere for you to sit, and there was nowhere to sit." So the cop said to one of the men who was sitting in the back row, said, "I'm sure one of you men would give your seat up for a pregnant woman." So, of course, one of the guys got up. The pregnant woman moved. Claudette Colvin still said, "Nope, I paid my fare. It's my constitutional right to sit here." Got berated, got dragged off the bus. All the while she's saying it's my constitutional right, right? And she was brought up and arrested for 2 charges. One was assaulting the police officer, which she didn't do, and there was all the witnesses concur, right? And the other was breaking the segregation laws, right? One of those arrests were dropped. One of those charges were dropped, right? And the other one, she got convicted. So she got put on indefinite probation, which, by the way, didn't get removed. This is 1955. That indefinite probation was not removed from her record until a couple years ago. Wow. She lived her whole life with that.
Indefinite
right?
probation.
Indefinite probation, right? But it was her lawsuit that actually went up to the Supreme Court. And it was under a different name, and I'll talk about that in a second. But she had this impact on the timeline. So what a lot of people don't know is Martin Luther King, the very first publicly facing thing he did, he was in his 26-year-old body, and a minister at Baptist Church in Montgomery. The first publicly facing thing he did was to organize and raise funds for the defense of Claudette Colvin. And that's significant, right?
Absolutely.
And during that time, he learned about the thinking that was starting to happen around, this is actually a reasonable lawsuit that might have legs, right? Now, there had been a Montgomery bus boycott 2 years earlier in 1953 in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Martin Luther King reached out to the reverend down there to get the scoop. Hey, what's the best practices? We talked about best practices before, right? Yes. What's the best practices that you learned in that situation, and how can we apply it? The Montgomery bus boycott took 6 months to plan. We just learned that it happened after Rosa Parks, but this thing was a concerted effort. Rosa Parks was handpicked to be the person that she was. She was the middle-aged, lighter-skinned, articulate, relatable symbol, right? Claudette Colvin was perceived as the darker-skinned troublemaker girl. And she was, she was pregnant. She became pregnant, right? And she had a baby soon after that. She wasn't the best symbol, right?
Yeah, she wasn't the symbol that everybody was expecting for, let's say that situation.
Not only expecting, but she wasn't the best symbol to carry the civil rights movement forward, to reach into populations that were beyond just black.
She was kind of like the George Floyd symbol of, police brutality of the time, somebody who may have had all these negative things attached to their name. She may have had the same, but in a different way.
There's great power in a symbol.
Yeah. Without
a doubt. I mean, peace lights, I say that, when I talk about peace lights too, peace lights is just a symbol. It's a piece of art, right? But there is power in. I mean, think about all the symbols that we're presented with every single day that we see. And symbolism. When you go into, I don't care what religion you are, you go into a place of worship, and there are symbols.
Yes.
And colors are a lot of those symbols.
Absolutely.
There's an interesting story that if we remember to come back to about colors.
Yeah.
Right. Before we leave, right?
I'm gonna take that.
Okay. So this whole situation where Claudette Colvin was arrested and everything, right? 2 years later, she's 17 years old. She's still getting death threats. She has a kid by then, and she can't get a job. And she's on probation. So someone could lie and say, hey, I saw Claudette Colvin do something, and boom, she's arrested, right? She moved to the Bronx, New York, where she worked at night, because she didn't want to be recognized during the day and killed, as a nurse's aide for the union up in the Bronx. And she retired in 2009.
Wow.
Right? No one knows or knew about this. And she was living right there in Parkchester in the Bronx. The Sheikh, same Sheikh Musa Drame, finds out about this icon of the civil rights movement and organizes an event to honor her on December 1st of 2016. Right? December 1st is the same day as Rosa Parks. It's also the first day of the International Month of Peace. Right? And New York State and New York City are the only two places in the United States that recognize, like the United Nations, the month of December as the International Month of Peace. So at this event, Sheikh invited Peace Lights to play at this event, and he invited me to speak. So I said I better get up to speed on Claudette Colvin if I'm going to talk about her, right? So I went to the library and got a book about Claudette Colvin. And in it, right away, what struck me was early on, it said, she's credited with, quote, accelerating the change in the plight of colored people. And I was like, wow, I could see how that's historically correct. That stands entirely. It's a historically accurate statement, right? But I'm an engineer. I see accelerating a change, and I think mathematically that's a second derivative, acceleration, right? What's that really mean? That's interesting territory, right? So I typed into Google, plight of colored people, 1955. The first thing that came up was all the lynchings here in the United States. 4,000 lynchings from the end of the Civil War in 1865 to 1955, 90 years. Now, to be fair, not all of them were racially motivated. I'd say probably 75, 80% were. I don't really know, but it's the majority for sure. And you could get lynched for cattle rustling and stuff like that, right? But the other ones were either you were black or you were white supporting black or something like that, right? So I had an epiphany. I said, you could say that the plight of colored people in 1955 could be measured in deaths per day, right? Now, eventually, over time, that went down.
Right.
If she accelerated the change, she pushed that curve to the left. And now there are some people who are no longer under the curve. They're over the curve. Those represent literally lives saved.
Lives saved. Yes.
So, here I am, getting ready to talk about Claudette Colvin, who's in the audience, right? It was exciting to meet her, I later got to be very involved in events honoring her. So I said this. Someone came up afterwards and said, Mr. Rogina, no one's ever told her story that way. Would you mind telling that story exactly the way you told it to the ambassador from the African Union to the United Nations? It's like, wow, Now, I've done a bunch of public speaking at conferences and whatnot, and people come up to you after you talk a lot of times, and I would say probably the majority of the time there's little to no follow-up, So I wasn't sure if this ever was going to happen, but sure enough, like a month and a half later, beginning sometime in January of the next year, I was going in to meet with one of the two ambassadors from the African Union. Now, the African Union is 55 nations, right? 1.3 billion people at the time. It's 1.4 billion now, right? And from my kind of roles at Hewlett Packard and everything else, you don't go into meetings with executives and not do your homework, right? So I knew a little bit about the African Union. Went in, talked to the ambassador, His Excellency Adonia Ayebare from Uganda, and he was the ambassador for peace and security. And we had this great discussion. Told him about Claudette Colvin. He didn't know who she was. Obviously knew Rosa Parks. And I said, wouldn't it be appropriate for but before I said, there's 6 regions of the African Union. North, South, East, West, and Central in the continent, and the 6th region being the diaspora. Right? Anyone who's ever left Africa and their descendants, specifically including the descendants of slaves. So I said to the ambassador, I said, wouldn't it be appropriate for the diaspora region of the African Union to bring up a motion to the African Union to honor this woman while she's still alive? I said, she should be a continental hero, not only in the continent, but in the diaspora, because it's about the act of standing up for your rights that's at the cornerstone of making things better, right? And he didn't disagree. He said, yes, that would be a very appropriate, thing to happen, but there really is no diaspora. And when I talk and when I speak, I like to look out in the audience because I just watch eyebrows go up everywhere. Like, what?
What did he just say?
Right. And I said the same thing. Like, wait, I read your charter. I know they're your 6th region. And we got into this deep conversation, right? And I said, it's kind of a weird spin on taxation without representation. Except in this case, they're defined as being part, but they have no representation, right? And And at some point he stopped me. He says, hold on, I don't meet with people like you a lot. Like I could see that to be true, and I believe that. Right? He says, I meet with world leaders and diplomats and stuff, but you have this outsider perspective, and you know what you're talking about. It's like, would you mind reviewing a document for me and just give me a professional outsider opinion? He said it would be very timely because we have a review of this document coming up. And I said, sure, I'd be honored to, right? So he calls in his secretary, also from Uganda, and they say some words that I later learned was Swahili, right? And she goes off, and like a minute later comes back and hands him a thick pamphlet, right, and leaves. He turns around, looks me in the eye, hands me the pamphlet, and goes, "This is our 50-year plan." Wow, I didn't really pick up on the fact that there was a 50-year plan before getting into that meeting, right? Like, okay, wow, it kind of got real, right?
Yeah, right there, it got real.
Right, it got real again, right?
He gave you the documents. He's like, here you go.
And I'm like, you know what? I'm gonna friggin' jump into this. I'm gonna do a real read of this. So I went out and I dove into it, and I started looking up stuff online, and I was looking for something that related back to Claudette Colvin. That was my whole filter that I was putting on the Agenda 2063. It's called, right? And I found it. It's a beautiful document. 7 aspirations for the future of Africa. And what I was impressed with, going back to Bill Hewlett, was they actually have means and mechanisms at a regional level, except for the diaspora, of course, to measure the progress of each country towards the aspirations and sub-aspirations in their 50-year plan. That gave a credibility to me. Right. I'm like, all right, it's not just you're saying stuff and you're not doing anything to track what's going on. So I found what I was looking for. The 4th aspiration of the 7 is for a peaceful and secure Africa. And the words underneath it say, a culture of peace and tolerance shall be nurtured in Africa's children and youth through peace education. I'm like, that's it, man. Claudette Colvin knew her rights that day. Learning those rights would fall under the umbrella of, not fully defined, but fall under the umbrella of peace education, right? And it saves lives. So Claudette Colvin's story teaches us that not only does she literally save lives, that she literally saved lives by knowing her rights, but that peace education literally saves lives, right? Because that's proven in Claudette's story. I searched the entire rest of the document. Not one mention of peace education.